Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. As you know, this series is on sibling grief and loss. And with me today are two exceptionally special guests that I am so excited to introduce to you all today. But I have to just tell a little story before we begin. In 2013, I took a course that was called Living from Your Soul by Neil Donald Walsh. And during that 9-week course, I met two just really incredible women that are with me today, Julie and Yvonne. And these two women have become really my soul sisters. But the irony is Julie had lost her brother prior to the course. I lost my brother a few months after we finished up that course. And then Yvonne lost her brother 9 months, I believe, after I lost mine. And so I ended up interviewing these women for my book, Rock On. And so they are here today for us just to be able to have a really beautiful, authentic discussion around our grief journeys. Before we begin,
this is an excerpt by Julie Brown from Troubled Waters, the second book in the Brownstone trilogy.
With everything Lily had learned in her life, it still didn't free her from the pain of loss. She was clear that life has no end. She understood that as spiritual beings, we live on different planes and that the soul never dies. But no matter the realm of residence, one harsh fact still remained. We are left behind. The sting of it would always remain, like a wound that could be split open with one cognizant thought. You are no longer with me.
So let me introduce them both to you. We have Yvonne. I always have such a hard time, pronounce your last name for me, Yvonne.
Stokkink. Just think of the word stocking, like a pantyhose. Stocking, but with a K at the end.
We've known each other 9 years and I still botch up her last name. So Yvonne is with us today and she is an energy alignment coach, which we will be talking more in depth today for any of you who may not understand what that means. But certainly for those that are grieving, it's really critical work, I think, during the grieving process. We also have Julie Brown with us today. She is an author of a trilogy called the Brownstone Series, and that series focuses on love, loss, and healing through grief. And she's also a psychology student. So welcome, both of you. I'm so excited.
Thank you, Susan.
I want you guys just to say whatever you'd like before we get started. So Yvonne, if you would like to say anything to our listeners before we get started, please do.
Oh, wow. I think most of it will come up in the conversation around grief and loss. Yeah, I'm just excited to get started. So I think I'll just let the conversation speak for itself.
Okay, Julie, do you want to say anything before we get started?
Well, I think, Rock On is really a beautiful book. And I know we're going to talk about a lot of things around grief, but I think you really gave Yvonne and I a platform and an opportunity to talk about our sibling loss and how that sibling loss is just different than any other loss you're going to experience. That sibling relationship is just different. So it's just an incredibly beautiful story. And Rocky just lived an incredible life. You really show that in the book. And so I'm really excited to talk and chat. We're always talking about death.
I know that we're going to be the three happiest people that you guys will see talking about death.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that is why of all of the numerous people that I interviewed, I wanted the two of you because I know the ways in which your lives have shifted since your brother's death. And that's what I want to talk about today. I really want to talk about that, the transformative things that can happen in the darkest periods of our life. And I think also what's important to note that when I interviewed each of you, Yvonne, you were 4 months into the grieving process. And Julie, I cannot remember how long, gosh, it was
30. I mean, I was 17. I'm 57 now. Who can do math?
yeah, it was around 30 years. And so you were both in very, very different places. And so I think what I'd like to open the conversation up today is how each of your lives have been impacted by your brother's death. And I know, Julie, for you, it took you a long time, I think, before you were really able to process your brother's death because you were so young at the time. And so for you, Yvonne, I think you had such a long journey of your own healing around your physical health because you had a stroke at a very young age. So you both were in very different places, I think, when your siblings had died. So let's start there. Let's start with a very open-ended question around how your lives have been impacted. And so I really want this to be organic. And if we talk over each other, we can just decide who wants to go first. But that's my question, very open-ended. Who would like to start?
I'm happy to start because immediately what comes to mind for me is that when my brother passed and he suicided when he was 32, and when we were making arrangements, we were inspired to pick a song by Lindsey Sterling, and it was called Take Flight, and another one, Song of a Caged Bird. And really that caged bird image really spoke to us and resonated with us because we felt like he perceived himself to be in a cage. He perceived himself to be limited and to have like broken wings almost. And that the only way that he could find freedom was to end his life. And for me, that really hit home because I too felt in a cage of sorts, except that mine was physical. I was so limited physically that I too had the strongest desire to be free and didn't really know how. So I felt like this caged bird that was flapping around this cage and couldn't find a way out because I was desperately trying thing after thing after thing to find something that would give me a little bit more energy and a little bit more breathing room to live, and could never really find it. So that the metaphor that we chose really hit home for me. And I just became really focused. I mean, I was already pretty determined to find healing, but I was also determined to find it in a different way than my brother did. And to really seek out that freedom and to really find out what my invisible cage was made of, because I could intuitively feel that I feel limited and I feel like I'm banging around these walls, but those walls aren't real. My limitations aren't real. I mean, I'm experiencing it as very low energy and all of these symptoms. And so they were real in a physical sense, but I knew that there was a way around them. And I knew that there was a way beyond the limitations that I was perceiving. And it was really through the intensity of going through the loss that I went into the deepest place that I had been myself, or the darkest place that I had been. But in climbing out and in finding my way through all of that, I eventually did find my freedom. And I am now in a place I wouldn't have even dreamed possible, because I've found myself saying just a couple months ago that I don't even feel like I have chronic fatigue anymore. And I've had it for 18 years. And I've recently, actually this month, I've made the first money that I've made since 2004. And I didn't even think that making my own money again and earning my own income and having a job of any description would be possible for me. And I found a way to create it. And I'm convinced that my brother helped along the way. And it's made me really passionate about assisting others in finding freedom where they're now feeling limited, being physically limited or through like physical or mental challenges, and to assist them in finding their own freedom. So that is really how my brother's story wound up paralleling some of mine and assisting in my own transformation.
Wow.
Yeah, it's so powerful. And Julie, please, I want this to be a three-way conversation. So you guys, so I just open it up to all of us.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about the death of our loved ones and the people that we love being a catalyst for change in our life. And I mean, it doesn't have to be that way, but it very often becomes a catalyst for something to shift in our lives because it's so powerful. I mean, I don't think there's anything that can stop you dead in your tracks like grief can. But, going to my story a little bit, because I was 17, it was traumatizing. And I think recently I've just started to come to terms with the fact that I was traumatized by my brother's death because of how old I was. And that was a moment where I was supposed to be going to college and I was supposed to be making all these great decisions and going out. And I didn't feel that way. I really felt a lot of fear. I mean, my brother was 30 when he died. He was 26 when he was diagnosed with cancer, but he was incredibly talented and he loved life. And I thought, at 17, I'm like, if someone can die, at that age, loving life, it's horrible. And it really instilled a lot of fear in me. And I feel like I kind of phased out and faded in and didn't take any chances and lived. All my decisions were based on fear. And I'm just now coming to terms with a lot of that. And I'm noticing that I'm shifting, like going back to college. And I wrote 3 books, like who did I think I was doing that? And, just kind of finding the things that make me happy. So, yeah, I thought I'd be done with grief. I thought I'd be done with that whole process of it. So it's really surprising to me at 57 that I'm still dealing with that childhood trauma, that 17-year-old, soul, and I'm working it out.
This idea of fear, I think, because certainly, Yvonne, we've had a lot of conversations around fear. And, I think it's a very poignant word when we think about grief, because obviously all of us know that we're going to die at some point. And we have this notion that people are supposed to die in the natural order of things, right? A parent dies first, and then the kid dies. The grandparent dies, the parent dies, the kid dies. And it's always been interesting to me when people say my kid's not supposed to die before me. And I'm like, in what world? We see kids die all the time. We know that happens. And yet, and I know this as a therapist too, that no matter what, it is the weirdest phenomenon. I think it's the way that we protect ourselves, but we never think it's going to hit our own backyard, right? And so,
I don't think it would have helped us if we did.
Right.
I don't think it would have helped, going through life thinking, well, any one of my loved ones could die at any moment.
Right.
There's about living in
no
fear.
way to live. I'd rather assume things are going fine and then just deal with the shock if it happens. But but I agree with you, Julie, because the one thing that I've held for a really long time, and that actually was preceded by other events that before my brother died, but it certainly reinforced it, is this fear of the other shoe dropping.
That's where I was going.
That if things are going well, then I start to get nervous.
100%. Yes.
It's almost like joy becomes scary.
Right.
Yes. And that is exactly where I was going with the fear base, because when something hits our own backyard like that, like you just said, Yvonne, it's like, okay, this most horrible thing has happened in our life. It has shattered our family as we know it. For me, the most terrifying thing, because you two are both so joyful as well, and I always have lived my life with the glass half full. And when this happened, the scariest part for me was, oh my God, am I going to feel like this for the rest of my life? Because it felt like someone had pulled the shade down on the sun and that my life had become this blanket of gray. And that is how I felt like. And I thought, if life is always going to be this way for me, I'm not sure what to do with that. And so I want to linger here in the place of fear and how that showed up in your life and what has happened as a result. And I guess what I mean by that is how you moved through it, however you want to speak to this idea of fear, because I think it is one of those feelings that can paralyze us, and it can also free us eventually. So please, who'd like to speak to it first?
No, I've been thinking a lot about this. So I'm like becoming self-aware of my journey being based in fear. So I'm kind of coming to terms with it and seeing things that maybe I could have or would have done differently had that event not happened to me at such a young age, and trying to process something that I couldn't process. I just really couldn't. But the idea of fear, I mean, I think it changes you, and it changes your decision making, and it changes your perception. And once your perception is changed, you're not living life to the fullest.
What were you afraid of, Julie? When your brother died
Um,
at 17, when you say that it's sort of, you had this lens of looking at the world.
I can't say specifically what I feared, but I can say I developed an attitude that life was not kind. The universe was not kind. This was not a good place. So I was going to be low key and just not try and do anything. And it just like Yvonne said, because as soon as you're happy, you're going to die.
Hmm.
And that was a very real feeling that I had at that young age, because my brother was really embracing life, incredibly talented, going out there and performing and acting, and just had such a great attitude. And you just laughed within 5 minutes of being in the room with him. And so I don't know. It's like, why did he have to die? He was going for it. So I can't say specifically what my fears were. It was just a general sense of, this is not a good place to be.
So hold that, because we'll come back to how you moved through that. Yvonne, did you have fears after, because you're the one who said you're waiting for that shoe to drop. So could you talk to us about what happened? And your brother, of course, your brother's death was obviously very traumatic too. He took his own life. So talk to us about your fear.
Yeah, so for me, I think in the most acute phase, I agree with you, Susan, it begins to feel so bleak and dark, and I felt so disconnected from myself that is a really scary place to be in, because even all the things that used to bring me joy now didn't. So you kind of feel a little unmoored and disconnected from life and from other people and from things that bring you joy. And it does feel scary, because when you're in that space, it feels lasting, though it never is. But you're also asking like how I moved through that. And I think that was just the grief phase. And I think the fear that lasted was the other shoe dropping fear, which I had, as I said, carried previously. And that really cemented this subconscious decision of, I need to make sure that everything is the way it is and it doesn't change too much. It's almost as if I made a mental map. Like, if you're over there and this is over there and this structure is over here, then I'll know where everything and everyone is. And I have this illusion that I'm safe and that I'm under any sort of control. And it's really been my deep healing work that has been the hardest work I've done, is to undo all of that, to release that control, to let go of those ideas and to start trusting life again. And that was really a necessary move for me to make in my healing journey, because you cannot keep living from fear, and you cannot keep in that constricted, confined control space and really live, because that ultimately was that cage that I spoke of. It was this self-created cage of self-imposed limitations, self-imposed restrictions, and these ideas of I need to control it all, because as Julie said, I just didn't really trust life. And I think there were parts where I didn't trust myself either. And so it really came back to how I moved through it, is to get back to that living from your soul aspect, is that when you connect to your heart, when you connect to your soul, and when you connect to, and this has been really important in my journey, when you connect to making something more important than your fear, making a dream more important than your fear, making some joy you do eventually find again more important, and you start believing and trusting that that joy means something and that joy is there for you and you're allowed to pursue it and you can free yourself to pursue it, that to make that possibility of something, to expanding your life from the cage to something bigger and making that more important, is what helped me move beyond the fear.
Yeah, and I want to stay here for a moment and talk about trauma for our listeners. That, if you think about, you move along in life in sort of this bubble of safety, and then trauma feels like that bubble gets popped and your whole life just shatters. And you're left sort of standing there looking at the pieces that are left of your life, and you have no idea how to put them back together and if you can put them back together. And so fear can be very, very traumatizing. And I think you guys have talked about, how do you trust the universe? Or, Yvonne, you use the metaphor of being inside a cage and these different images, because fear really is very much a prison. Because when you are fearful of life or fearful that that other shoe is going to drop, the way I like to think about trauma is that if we start at ground zero and something happens, you might move to a 5. After trauma, you're at a 7. On a scale of 1 to 10, you're already at a 7. So something very small has to happen to blow you up to a 10, right? Because you're no longer at that baseline of 0. So like my mom had a stroke and we lived with that for 12 and a half years. And my brother, Rocky, the one who died, had been here. He flew back to Bali. My mother had a stroke and he flew back. So that was a very poignant, that's all through my book, right? That memory of when he flew back after her stroke. But what happened after my mother's stroke is every time I would get a call, it was such a traumatizing event that every time I would get a call, my heart would just shoot out of my body. And then when my brother died, I felt like I lived in a heightened state of everything that you guys are saying, of fear, of every time the phone rang. It didn't matter who it was. I thought I was always living in this heightened state of something horrible is going to happen. And I have to be prepared at any moment, because my mother's stroke was the first traumatizing event, and then my brother's death. And that felt like it redefined my life and the way I saw the world. In a way, it felt torturous every single day. And so what I would like to talk about is what very tangible things that each of you did that really helped to shift from fear to love, because I know the two of you so well now, that helped you shift out of that place from fear to love, because love is actually the only thing that's real, right? So we either live from love or we live from fear, which is not the opposite of love, listeners. It is the lack of trust, lack of love. And so I would like to hear from the two of you. And I know this is a long journey. I'm not saying you woke up one day and said, hey, I'm going to live from love today and I'm all done with fear. So what did it look like? What did that journey look like? Because we all live a joyful life now, and that did not happen overnight.
Right.
It'll be 8 years for me tomorrow that my brother died. Yvonne, you're going on 8 years as well. And Julie, you're in 40 years now.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this path to joy and trust.
Yeah, well, I think for me, several things really helped. Well, it's been a huge journey. Trying and encapsulate that is the practice of compassion for my own journey, and to not demand of myself that I be anywhere else than where I really was. Because for years I carried this internalized, well, I should be further along with this, or I should be doing better, or I should be feeling more joyful more of the time, or this shoulding was happening inside my head. And with that, you're judging where you are. And if you judge where you are, you can't move. So that's when you start creating feelings of stuckness. And that's where I really halted in my healing journey. I would go forward, but then I would fall back, and I would find something that really helped me. But like an elastic band that is being stretched, I would be pulled back. And that was because I was still rejecting parts of my experience and rejecting parts of myself that I hadn't fully met yet. So for me, what has been really helpful is to, tap into the compassion and not judge my experience, and to have understanding. And I love that that's coming up, because that is also something that really came out of Neil's course for me, is that 2 pillars for me, are the aspects that I want to embody, are compassion and understanding. So it's tapping into the compassion that, it happened the way it did because that's what I had the skills to at the time. We all act with the understanding and awareness that we have at the time. And to also have a greater understanding of what I was able and not able to do at the time, an understanding of how the nervous system works, because that has also been really helpful. That's like a very practical aspect of it. But when you're in fight flight, your brain just operates differently and you cannot think clearly. So all of those behaviors like control and of like seeking this fix and trying really hard to get to the next place and trying really hard to do this or trying really hard to do that, and all of that trying really hard really backfiring then, is that was just all fueled from my whole brain, my whole nervous system being in a state of fight flight. And it's about learning to really calm my system down and become more present and land more in the moment. And again, through compassion, through understanding, you can really apply those when you're present. And that's when you can really learn to meet yourself and meet all parts of yourself, so that even the parts that you've rejected and left behind in some places in your journey, you can then go meet them, welcome them, and embrace them. And then you can move forward again in a much more integrated way. And I really believe that that is the way to wholeness, is when you meet the parts of you that you had previously rejected, when you meet the parts of you that you judge in some way, that you deem not good enough, that you deem not worthy. And when you can embrace them and say, you know what, I love you. And of course you are the way you are. And you make perfect sense. And thank you for trying to keep me safe, dear fear. They're just parts of us that are trying to keep us safe. The fear is not there to make your life miserable. The anxiety isn't there to freak you out. It's just there because it's a part of you that is kind of like a superhero that just wants to stand in the way of anything that might not be safe.
Right.
And when you have that understanding that that's what it's trying to do, even though, you know, from its lack of understanding, it creates the experience it's trying to protect you from, that when you understand that, and you can have compassion for those parts, and then you no longer reject them, you can include them, and then you feel whole. And that is just such a beautiful feeling to have, and such a peaceful place to operate your life from. Because for me, that's when I'm truly free. Because when I meet myself where I am in the moment, and I don't make any part of my experience wrong, and I stop trying to be over there where I'm not yet. And even with the insecurities that might be present, even with the fears that might be present, and I just love that anyway, then I'm really present, really in the moment. And that's where I'm free to move in any direction because I'm really here.
I love that. I have to tell you that just about a week ago, I hit a moment where I just stopped what I was doing and felt like I had to go back to my 17-year-old self and give her a hug. Wow. So I think that's really interesting that you're saying that.
I've done the same thing in past weeks. Interesting.
Yeah. Yes. And I didn't read it anywhere, and it wasn't in some self-help book or anything like that. It was just this intuitive moment where I was like, oh, yeah. So I kind of went back to that 17-year-old girl and gave her a hug. I wanted to say one thing about fear. And in my particular situation, I was not self-aware of that fear. So part of what you're talking about, Yvonne, I think is a self-awareness, because that's everything. Because once you're aware that you're having this thought, or that you perceive the world this way, or I was traumatized at that time and it changed me. Once you're self-aware, then you can actually start taking action to make changes and change your perception. But one of the things that I did was I started doing meditation, and I started with Deepak Chopra because he had these guided meditations, which I needed. And one of his meditations was on what do you want? And you're supposed to meditate and just say, what do I want? What do I want? Why am I here? You know, what is it that I want to do? And I'm convinced that when you ask a question, you're going to get an answer. You don't even have to be in meditation. If you are just deeply asking the universe a question about your life or about anything, you will get the answer in a matter of days. You just have to pay attention. But I started writing books just a matter of weeks after that meditation. I was creating characters. They were interacting with each other. I'm like, what? Where is this coming from? I have never had so much fun in my entire life than writing these books. And I want to write more because I love hanging out with these characters so much. But I didn't go to school for this. I don't have a degree. I don't have a master's in English or anything like that. Or I never took writing classes. I was just really starting to meditate on what was inside that I could do. And it was just this creative flow of these books. So meditation, I think, was a really big help for me to kind of quiet down the noises, going on around us and focus inside.
I have such a deep appreciation for what both of you are offering to our listeners. And I want to talk about creative flow because both of you are artists. And, the one
Yvon, I love your stuff, Yvon. Yeah. It's so, I know, just love it.
I've got a piece of her art in my office that I wish
you guys could see. It's so cool. I asked you about it. I emailed you. I'm like, what is this? And I started following a couple of people, not to interrupt you. I started following a couple of people on Instagram, and I am telling you, you are amazing. Even in comparison to some of the other stuff I see. It's like how you seem to be able to take all these different pieces and it looks like one cohesive. It's just amazing. Sorry.
No, that's great because this is a very important part because I think even though you guys haven't said it, I think a lot of healing happens through art. And Yvon, I've got a piece, like I said, a piece of your artwork that I look at all the time and it brings me such deep joy. So let's talk about fear and art because I do think that art is a portal for all of us to have that. Love is expansive and fear is restrictive. And I think in order to create, we've got to allow ourselves to be in an expansive place. And so, you guys know I wrote my dissertation on writing through grief and loss and trauma. And the irony is that when my brother died, I had to really try out my own theory and I wrote my way through grief. I always encourage people to write or to do art or to do something where the energy, when you think about grief is love with no place to go. And so we can literally curl up in a ball on a couch, and that can be metaphorical or literal, and really retreat from life. Or how do we give ourselves the space and the grace to grieve? Whether that is through a grief group, whether that is through talking to a good friend, or whether that is a release through some form of art, whatever that looks like for people. In early grief, what we know for certain is that it can be debilitating. And it's in that debilitation that I think we have to make a choice at some point. There are no clocks or calendars to grief. People hear me say this all the time. And I do think, though, there comes a point in your grief, if it is prolonged, do you need help in some way? Do you need some kind of an intervention? Right. And that self-awareness, Julie, I think is a part of it. And so, it took me a long time to get to this place where I call the outlet for art. I think that honesty, that self-compassion, we need to give ourselves that space and grace to do whatever during grieving. I think we also need to know, is it time? How do we know? How do we know if we need some additional help? You guys know I saw a grief and loss coach for well over a year. I am a therapist. So for me, reaching out for help was a very natural thing for me to do. I know, Julie, that was not your experience. And Yvon, I don't believe you saw a therapist, did you? I don't remember you.
Not for the grief. No, not for the grief, but I've worked with a lot of different coaches over the years, but I didn't really seek as much help as I probably needed. But I was also operating that should is coming around again, like, oh, I should be able to do this myself, or even just the thought, oh, I can do this myself. And that may be true, but that doesn't mean that that is the most helpful thing for you. So I did a lot of things myself, and I appreciate myself for the fact that I did. But at the same time, it makes the journey more difficult if you try and figure out yourself, because it's like that saying, you can't really solve the problem with the same thinking that created it. So it really helps to get into get support from another mind, someone who's literally not your mind, to just give you an easier access to a different way to think and a different way to feel and a different way to process your emotions, because then you're not stuck in the same loops of what life trained you into. So there isn't any wrongness about that. There's no limitation in that. It's just that life trains all of us into certain patterns because they're patterns and hardwired into the brain and into the body. They're hard to break out of. But if you have support, if you have someone who can reflect things back to you, I've had a coach say things and interrupt my line of thinking and just ask me a very simple question, even just a simple question like, is that true? Where I go, oh, I hadn't really paused to even check if my thought is even true. And those kind of pattern interrupts are just really helpful. But I love what you're saying about art too, Susan, just to get back to that, is that I think what allows art to do, it's just a very safe way to express your emotions. And it's for most people, it's easier to come by and to access. I also think because it's a way to express and experience your emotions and let that out in a safe way, it simultaneously introduces a little bit of play. And I think play, there's just such healing power in play, because it gets us back in touch with the part of us that is our true self, the whole self, the playful kid in us that never really damages or is hurt by anything, that doesn't get broken no matter how broken we might feel because of what happens. And we get back in touch with that through play and creative expression really easily.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you were talking about, Susan, was, I believe you said something like, we're not going to feel this way forever. You're not going to feel this way forever. I think it's really important to know that the goal is to transcend grief and not to remain in that state. And you don't have to remain in that state to honor that person or to remember that person, but we are meant to transcend it. It doesn't mean that it won't affect us, years down the road, or that we're going to forget. So I was thinking the other day about how we have to set an internal alarm bell when we're grieving. And I think you set that alarm clock internally by saying, I'm not going to feel like this forever. And that will come back to you in a year and a half. If you're still in that deep depression, that not being able to get out of bed, that not being able to eat very much, not finding joy in things, that alarm bell is going to go off and you're going to say, okay, I'm still in this place. I got to get out. So I think that's really important. You can get really, really comfortable in that sad space. You can get so comfortable in it. It can feel like a warm blanket to just sit in that grief and just be sad and not interact with people and interact with life or connect anymore. And you can get stuck there. So I think it's important to set that internal alarm clock. The goal is to get out.
I have no words for how powerful that is, what you're saying right now, because this internal alarm clock, I think, is an indicator of, hey, do I need help being pulled out of this black hole? Right. And so there's a couple of things. So I want to talk a little bit more about this internal alarm clock. We always hear, get through the first year, get through the first year. The first year is the hardest because that first year is the first time, doing X, Y, and Z without the person in our life.
You got to surpass every holiday for the first time,
right.
Get past that first Christmas, that first birthday. Yeah.
Right. That's what we hear. Right. And I think that what nobody ever told me, even though it's not that acute grief where you feel like you can't get out of bed, that I think that grief can get worse before it gets better. And the only way I've been able to put language around it in my own situation is I think it takes a while for the shock, obviously, to wear off. And then once the shock wears off, it's this reality that, and just to put this in context for everyone listening, the three of us all believe in life after death. We all believe the soul lives on. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with that. Not everybody shares that belief, and that is fine, but that is our belief. So even though I had that deep belief, it sure as hell didn't make my grief any less painful, because I still was not going to hug my brother Rocky again. And I can talk to him all day long in my head, but it's not as though I can hear his voice talking back to me. So I think that, if somebody had told me, hey, it's going to get worse before it gets better when you really start to understand that there is a even though everything's temporary and we know that the permanence, while I'm here living, I'm not going to see my brother in physical form again. That might have been helpful, I think, to have that context, because I didn't understand why, as time marched on, that it felt more horrible before it started to feel like, wow, I really can sort of weave this loss into my life in this way that it makes life sweeter. It makes it more gentle. It makes the joyful moments so much more joyful. Like I've got chills right now talking about that, because I never in a million years thought I would ever be here. So I don't know if you guys want to speak to what I'm saying right now, and where that shoe dropping, that grief, before it starts to become expansive, it can feel incredibly, it feels like my life was shrinking rather than expanding, even though time was marching on, because people kept talking about time. And that time just felt suffocating to me. So I don't know if you guys want to speak to that, or.
Yeah, I can so relate to everything you're saying. I keep nodding my head with every word, because I too had got these, you read these things and it's like, oh, this year mark, and just get through the year. And afterwards, I was kind of sort of pleased with where I'd gotten like a year, but then there was this big dip that happened, fueled by this idea of, oh, I've been past the year, now what? And life still, I've gotten through like the first crisis mode, and I've gotten myself sort of back together again, but I didn't feel remotely myself yet. I was still very disconnected from myself. And in some ways, struggled more with my own stuff. There's the processing of the grief, but then there's also the processing of what it does to you, or what it did to me personally, and how it shaped me, and having to make sense of that somehow without any rule or guidebook telling me how you're supposed to go about doing that. And so, it felt harder. And then it's very tempting to then start to judge your own experience. And that leads to that stuck place that I spoke of earlier, that when you start judging it, when you start thinking, well, I should be over it by now, we're past the year mark. I've had these lighter moments a month ago, why am I so sad still? And just judging my own experience. And that just made it really hard. And had I known that it can go up and down, and there's nothing wrong with you or with your process when that happens, and had I had tools to not judge my own experience, and to acknowledge that every single person's grief journey is different, and that if your sadness lasts, or if it's recurring, or if depressive episodes come back around again, that is not a sign of a mistake.
Right. And we should never compare our grief with someone else, because everybody's experience is different. One person who loses a mother and another person who loses a mother is going to have possibly a completely different experience. It's sometimes based on our relationship with the person, or how we viewed that person in our life. So we should never compare.
My sister and I literally lost the same person. We both lost our brother, the same person in our lives, but we couldn't have had more different experiences of our grief, because of our relationship to our brother was different. Our place in life was different. She was 8 months pregnant when it happened with her first child. And if you can't even compare it when you've lost the exact same person.
Correct. Yes. Even my siblings, I'm the youngest, and all my siblings were married and had kids. So their experience was completely different than mine at 17, just trying to figure out what I want to do with the rest of my life. So 100%.
And I think, and it's just so funny, Julie, because I wrote down, this is a beautiful segue, which you did not even set it up to be this, around our different perspectives of losing someone, because it has to do with the last conversation we had. Some of us carry guilt, some of us don't. So the way in which the person dies, the relationship that you had, the last conversation you had, all of that has an impact on the way in which we deal with that loss. But I want to talk about this from a very powerful story that you told me about your parents, about the hole in the screen.
The hole in the screen.
The hole in the screen. I love this story, and so much that I think about it It has stayed with me for all of these years. That's one of the most powerful examples of how we deal with grief differently. Like it's,
Yes.
so will you share that story with our listeners?
Yes. So my parents joined Hope for Bereaved, which is an organization here in our community that helps people with grief and has therapy. And, so they became volunteers, and they have a book that they put out every year and people can write in it. My mother wrote this story called The Hole in the Screen. And it was about a day where my brother and his wife, or maybe she was his girlfriend at the time, were playing softball in the backyard or playing catch. And the ball went through the screen and put a hole in the screen. And after my brother died, my mother kept saying to my father, will you please fix that? It reminds me of that day. It reminds me of Keith. And my father said, well, I don't want to fix it because it reminds me of that day and it reminds me of Keith. And I don't know if the hole ever got fixed, but yeah, it's really neat. It just is such a great story to show us how differently we view things and perceive things.
And the things that we talk about and the things that we don't, because grief can silence us in a way that I think almost nothing can, the way grief does. And I think that because of this idea of love and deep love within a family, this was a common theme with the people that I interviewed for the book, is that we don't want to breathe our sibling's name. We think it's going to cause our parents more pain.
Right.
And
I went through that.
And this idea of a hole in the family and the way in which you spell it, right? Whole, H-O-L-E, or wholeness, W-H-O-L-E. And it's very profound to me because it really is, it's our perspective, right? Because one thing I learned at the Center for Grieving Children in doing bereavement work is that it's such a misnomer that healing in a family and creating that wholeness, right, is to be able to talk about the whole in the family. It's just so powerful.
I love that so much. And it's really hitting me because it's, for me, the whole healing journey is about return to wholeness. I mean, the words heal, whole, and holy all have the same root word. And for me, that's just pure poetry, that is the same. And for me, I've had this idea of, and I don't know if I'm ever going to write a book, but I had this idea that if I ever do write a book, it's going to be called Whole.
Wow.
Because my journey started with that stroke, and that is literally like a hole in your head, but it led me to be whole in my being, whole in my heart. And your story, Julie, is just so profound, because I believe that even if you have holes where you can patch it up or you can fix it, you're still whole. But if you leave it there, you're still whole.
Right.
You're still whole, holes and all.
All right. Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And to me, that is just so magical and so.
Yeah, it's true though. I mean, I think it's all of the cliches that we hear or the idioms that we hear, or, whatever, that, you can't have the rainbows without the rain, etc. But it's true. I think that our holes in our life lead to wholeness. I mean, it's the same thing, because every trauma that happens to us, it is like poking little holes in our soul, right?
Yeah.
And, I think it's Marianne Williamson. Everyone's heard me say this on the podcast 1,000 times, that we all have cracks, and that's how the light gets in. And one of the activities we would do with the children at the Center for Grieving Children is they would have a clay pot and we'd have them break it. And then they would paint all of these pieces and they would put it back together again. They would glue it, with a glue gun, and it was gorgeous. And there were all of these holes in the pot because, of course, you can't put it back together perfectly. And the way the sunlight would stream through the pot and the colors and the glitter and the paint. And obviously it was a metaphor for life after grief and how you can put your life back together again. And it's not going to look exactly the same, but it's going to be beautiful in a different kind of way. And I really think that that's exactly what we do. And, in working with people who are grieving, there is a choice. And I'm going to say this, that people can get stuck, they can get stuck in the grieving process. They can get stuck in deep anger. They can get stuck in debilitating depression. brings us full circle around know when you need to get help, the alarm clock, Julie, that you talked about, that I am going to say this could be very unpopular, but there comes a point in grief that it is a choice, that we can look to the sunlight. There is healing, there is help. And I'm going to tell you all this. The person who has passed on does not want you to stay stuck in grief.
No.
They want you to have joy and to live your life. And maybe you think about it this way. I have decided that I want to live my life to the fullest in honor of my brother's spirit.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
Instead of being guilty when I laugh, I love to laugh because I imagine him laughing with me. So we are coming to the end. I want to know, the two of you, tell me where you are now and how you celebrate your wholeness.
I think I'm still on the journey. And I think for me, I probably now have to deal more with the trauma than the actual grief. Maybe they're both the same. I don't know what I'll discover about that. Maybe grief is traumatizing. But I think that now that I'm aware of that my 17-year-old self went through that, I'll work on that. I will work on that. But I think writing these books helped me to reconnect again, because I was in that phased out, faded in, don't do anything, and I had this storyline and this idea, and I wanted to connect with people. And that was the whole purpose of it, was to join back into society a little bit, maybe, So I think I'll continue to write, and that will bring me probably the deepest joy that I've experienced so far is writing. So, yeah.
And Julie, we will have your books. We'll have links to your Brownstone series in the show notes.
Thanks.
Yeah, so for me, I really love what you said, Julie, because for me, it's the wholeness. There's a journey to it, and I'm not there, but I am, for the first time in my life, really in a place where I'm just saying, you know what, for me, the journey to wholeness is the whole point, and not getting to it. And I've never been able to say that until now, because I was always like, oh, to get to the next thing and get to the next place and chasing that. And right now I'm thinking, you know what, it's beautiful where I am, and I'm just celebrating that. And I think of wholeness, I've imagined wholeness to be like when we're born, I envision it like a circle where we are born perfect, whole and complete, and nothing ever changes that. And there may be events and circumstances that poke holes somewhere in that circle, but then we grow around and we make something of that circle. But I think that what happens is that through our own choices, that's why choice is such a key experience to get your power back and to decide what you're going to make of your experiences, that you start to fill in the circle with all the colors that you want. And the more you fill in that circle, the more you experience the wholeness that you already are. Start out with the outline and you are whole, but you don't really know it yet. And then through life, you paint in the circle, and then you can experience yourself as whole.
And Yvonne, I want you just to say a little bit more, and we'll have links to your website and your work, but how, as an energy alignment coach, fits in to exactly what you're talking about. Do you want to just take a couple of minutes and explain what helping to align energy means?
Yeah, so for me, it's places where I lost my energy, or the places where I got out of alignment, out of sync, out of harmony with who I really was and who I choose to be. Because even if someone listening is thinking, well, I don't even know who I am anymore, that's not even a problem, because you get to decide starting today what you want that to look like. And then with every choice, you get to decide, okay, this is the kind of person that I want to be. This is the kind of thing that I like doing. This is what brings me fun. This is what makes me feel joyous. This is what makes me feel fulfilled. And the more you do that and allow yourself to pursue that, the more you will experience your own joy and your own freedom and your own wholeness. And the more you pursue that, the more you will also encounter the things that will get in the way of that. And that's just through old patterns and thinking and patterns and behavior that life has grown you into. None of that is wrong or a mistake, but you can help yourself. And with a coach, you can help heal those parts of yourself. So you can go to the part of you that may be judging yourself for your own experience, or that may be stuck in a traumatic event in the past, or stuck in your grief, and meet that part of yourself to free up that energy that is stuck there and make it available to yourself again. And that is really the work I'm passionate about doing. And it's really about assisting people into returning to that wholeness and to that really lived experience of what that looks like. And for me, it's really everything that you can do to bring your own energy, your own aliveness, your own fulfillment, your own joy. That is the purest energy there is. And there are ways that you can help yourself access that and express that. And that's what I want to help people do.
That's beautiful.
That's awesome.
I made this soul collage card, and there's dolphins at the top, and there's a dark night at the background, and some candles in the front. And I wrote a poem to go with that. And it said, "Don't wait to play on a lighter day. Let it accompany you through the dark and light the way."
Which this just freaks me out too, because when
It's sitting on my desk today.
Well, and do you guys remember at the end of the book when I was in Tacones, Mexico, and the two dolphins jumped out of the water, and the dolphins never, ever swam in that water because it was too cold? And you're just holding up a card to show me two dolphins.
Yeah.
It's just incredible.
That's amazing.
That is amazing. And a beautiful nugget for me too, because as we're going through this conversation, you bring up art. I'm thinking to myself, I have the thought in my head, like, that's the missing piece. That is what I want to bring into my practice, into my coaching.
Can I say one thing about art though? Because when I was writing, I wasn't writing from a place of grief. This wasn't a journal for me that I was like, what do you call it, Susan, when you're writing your,
absolutely.
Your, like some kind of healing thing? No, it wasn't that. I was creating, I think I was more giving birth to an innate ability that I had that I didn't know. And that's what helped me reconnect with life again. Yes. And help me in the healing process. This is not a book about me and my grief. There is grief in it. Lily does lose someone, loses her parents. So there is a lot of that in it, but it's also about her journey of discovering her gifts and her abilities and moving on in life subconsciously. But was I maybe doing a little bit of that? But none of the story can I really personally relate to. I use my imagination to create something. And that, came from the meditation, came from dealing with the trauma, deciding I was going to live life again and I was going to embrace it and I wanted to reconnect. So that to me is kind of what the art has done for me. It's not about my grief and losing my brother. It's the gift that I buried all these years that I finally was able to bring to the forefront. So
I think that what creativity does, it connects you with your essence again. It connects you with you again.
Yes.
Grief is what disconnects you from your essence.
Yes.
Exactly.
And creativity reconnects you with your essence again.
Right.
And that's the expansiveness versus restriction I was talking about. And going back, it brings you home.
And I think art, because it's something that we learn, most of us, when we're privileged enough to have that experience, but that we have as children memories, and I think also innate abilities that we're all born with, where play is such a natural state of being.
Yes.
That even if you haven't really been creative before, your soul will know how to be creative.
Yes.
And even if you just make a mess on a canvas, or even if you just scribble, it doesn't have to look like anything. It doesn't have to be anything. It doesn't have to become your life's purpose.
Right.
It doesn't have to be on the wall somewhere. It just has to be something that
give you joy.
Yeah, it's just something that expresses, as Neil taught us, like every act is an act of self-definition. So everything you do is an expression of who you are. And I think creativity just brings out who that is and what that literally looks like.
And grief does have its place in our journey because it's that quiet time. It's kind of like a dark night in the soul. It's that shock and that moment where everything just stands still inside of you. And then you get to a place where you got to really want it. You got to really want to come out. You got to really want to connect and live. You got to want it. And there's so much power in that. And amazing things can happen. So,
what didn't really come up, but we touched on the side there a little bit, is that some people who are saying like, who are really believing like, it will never be the same again as before this person passed, or, there's not going to be joy again, or I'm not going to get over it or past it, that there are those who are believing that in some level, that if they hold on to that statement and hold on to that pain, that it somehow honors the person they've lost.
Yes.
Because they're believing on some level, if I get over it and pursue joy again,
yes,
it's almost as if I'm saying that it was all right that it happened.
And not loving that person and not, that's a slippery slope.
Dishonoring them to say, I'm really happy again, even though I don't have my kid around anymore, or I don't have my sibling around anymore. Right. And I think that, as you said, it's just because of that you have to get to a place where you can really connect the dots for yourself that, living fully is how I honor them.
Right. And I think we have this thing about moving on. People say moving on, but I don't think we move on. I think we move forward with the people that we have lost in our heart. And that's that deep honoring. I just have no words to express my gratitude for this conversation. And of course, the timing of this conversation is so perfect. And I have such a deep love for both of you.
When is grief not ever a good conversation?
Exactly. And, this is what I'll also say, the gifts and the miracles that show up after, if we allow them. Yes. You guys are two miracles that have showed up in my life. I mean, I think about the people that I've met, what has happened in my life since my brother's death. Someone said to me one day, well, there's nothing good that has come from the death of my child. And I said, maybe you can't see it yet, but there are always gifts that show up in the space that our loved ones leave behind. Of course, we would want them. Of course, we would choose to have them here, but they're not. And so because they're not, there are miracles that show up. And when we begin to heal, we begin to acknowledge and see those more and more and more. And so I want to acknowledge that you two are miracles in my life that I am grateful for all of the time. Thank you, as I said, for what you're bringing to the world, but what you've brought to my world. I just love you both so much.
Thank you, Susan. You're amazing.
I love you guys.
Love you too.
Love you too.
So
rock on.
Rock on.
Rock on.
So
we will rock on.
We will.
We will rock on.
And all of you listeners will too. And thank you for being here with us this week. And please check out our show notes. Love to all of you.